Presenter is Gary French. He's a physician. Hey, Gary. Hello. They're getting you mic'd up, so stay right there. You're good. He is the medical director of the Medical Cannabis Program with the Department of Health here in New Mexico. He works in primary and urgent care, typically serving underserved populations, correctional settings. So we've got a correctional friend there. And he is very passionate about doing research-based recommendations on the future cannabis policy here in New Mexico. So he's here to educate us about policy regarding cannabis. Here, we'll share this. Look, we're friendly. So everybody else has had to do a fun fact. So while they're getting you mic'd up, can you, on the spot?
A fun fact. I put together my Uni pizza oven this past weekend and I'm anxious to use it. So yeah, I'm going to try the pizza oven out.
What do you like on your pizza?
Prosciutto and arugula. So
fancy. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll get Dr. French going.
I have a new Chihuahua, my COVID pet, and I have to say it's been the funnest dog I've ever had. It's a little ball. His name is Bueno. And when he's bad, it's Bueno no. So, yeah. And I apologize, folks. This is, technology, and but it's exciting information. And I do want to cover it because April 1st, recreational cannabis sales went into effect. And so I definitely want to explain to you the difference between the medical and the recreational side of things, because there's been a lot of consternation over what would happen to the medical cannabis program when recreational sales went into effect. And so I want to answer that question and also explain what the benefits are of the medical cannabis program. And while we're working on that, I'm going to go ahead and plug our online patient portal, because beginning in August of 2020, we did start to use electronic applications, again, because of COVID and just because of the rural areas where people live in this state. We wanted the electronic application so patients could obtain a medical cannabis card without having to drive long distances or without having to put themselves at risk because of all the COVID precautions. So in addition to them being able to use the online portal, we made it so that providers can do the whole application process on that portal and use telemedicine to do it. And I know we had a telemedicine presentation earlier. And we do have some stringent regulations with regards to the medical cannabis program, in the sense that telemedicine has to be done both with an audio and video component, no telephone only. And that was a regulation, or the telemedicine definition was created back in 2007. And we used to have an in-person requirement as well, but we got rid of that to make it, again, more easy for patients in a telemedicine environment to see the providers. And I'll talk more about those things later, but I do want to invite you all to go to our website, and I'll have it up here, it's in the presentation, and play around with the online portal and register to be a certifying provider. We need providers that are vested in their patients, that are not checking boxes, that are checking patients, okay? And that are following up with them. Not a once a year to renew a card, but consistently. And again, the best person for a patient to see is their primary care provider for medical cannabis card. That's the person that knows them. That's the person that knows the medication. Yet there's been reticence to do that. And oftentimes it's fallen to other individuals to fill that gap. And so I just want to invite you to, if you don't do it, someone else will. And it's better you. And, oh.
Quick question, and could you repeat it for people online? So I'm a federal, and so where can people find providers to help them with the process?
Great question, because we do have the VA and then we also have IHS. And so for those, exactly. And so I can't plug any specific entity or agency, but there are numerous out there. And again, I do understand that with the federal, that you're not necessarily able to do the certification. Some providers still do, but again, some don't. And I can just say that a lot of times the dispensaries might have an affiliation with a provider that works with them and then certifies patients there in an office, typically separate or at least down the way, that they can help certify the patient. And then, the patient will get a little education with regards to types of products. And so that sometimes is a good model. There are a lot of internet entities or agencies reaching out to patients and trying to get them that way, or trying to get their interest that way. And they sometimes will plug the patient into a provider here in the state of New Mexico, and they might do it telemedicine that way. So I think we're up and running here. Let me step back. All right, here we go. All right, so New Mexico's actually had medical cannabis for a very long time. Back in 2007, the Lynn and Erin Compassionate Use Act was passed. And again, the purpose of this was to allow for the beneficial use of medical cannabis in a regulated system for alleviating symptoms caused by debilitating medical conditions and their treatments. So I want to go there where it says alleviating symptoms. Medical cannabis is not for treatment. It is to alleviate the symptoms associated with a condition or its treatment, okay? And, sometimes people assume, oh no, the cannabis might be treating my cancer or treating, we want to make sure that we don't, elevate cannabis too high. Again, it's to alleviate symptoms. And that goes along with why providers, we don't prescribe cannabis. We are simply certifying that the patient has a medical condition that would benefit from the cannabis, or symptoms that would be alleviated from its use. So again, the role of the Medical Cannabis Program, we review, verify, and issue patient registry cards. We work with the medical providers to help educate them with regards to cannabis types to use. We work with the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board. Their role is to address adequate supply and then also to recommend new conditions to the list of 28. Well, currently we have 28 qualifying conditions. And then new is the Public Health and Safety Advisory Committee. And that was a committee formed with the Cannabis Regulation Act, which went into effect back in 2021, June of 2021. And their goal is to monitor the health effects of legalized cannabis, really a public health outreach. And again, that is in Department of Health, whereas more the recreational side, that's going to be over in RLD, or License and Compliance Department. So this is our patient enrollment, and as you can see, it's rather linear. We currently have over 133,000 New Mexicans in the New Mexico Medical Cannabis Program. And you can see it continues to grow and grow in a linear fashion. And it's not stopping. Even with the onset of recreational or commercial adult use sales, we still have numerous patients still applying to the program. Here's the age ranges. And I would have thought this would have skewed to a younger population. But again, these are medical. So this is just medical. I think if we added in the recreational, we might see a skew for a younger subset. But again, pretty consistent over the age ranges. And I think that bodes to the types of conditions that people are using the cannabis for. These are the three largest groups of patients, top three conditions rather. And so we have post-PTSD, severe chronic pain, and then cancer. And as you can see, the PTSD is over 50% of our patient population. Here are the 28 qualifying conditions. And again, these are not static. These can be updated. That's why we do have the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board. Individuals, patients, practitioners can submit petitions to the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board to be heard. The next Medical Cannabis Advisory Board meeting, I believe, is December 6th. It is on our website. You're welcome to attend. We do it via Zoom. And so the petitioner will submit data, scientific data, research articles, and then the board will discuss those and determine whether they want to recommend a new qualifying condition. But I think that with these 28, we pretty much cover just about anything that cannabis is going to have an alleviating effect with. So I mentioned that word adequate supply and that the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board helps determine what an adequate supply is. And the reason I share this is because there's been a lot of confusion. Adequate supply does not equal inventory, okay? Adequate supply, I think a better term would have been patient limit, or what the patient needs access to have the appropriate benefit. But it doesn't dictate how much cannabis is in the inventory of a store or is being produced. Okay, and so what is the adequate supply? Well, 425 units over a 90-day period of time is currently what a patient has access to. And that's a rolling 90 days. So day 91, the purchases they made on day 1 would then come back on. Okay, so it's a rolling 90 days. And you ask, well, what is a unit? Typically we would think of ounces or grams, but again, a unit is 200 milligrams of THC, which is essentially how much THC one would find in a gram of dried flower. So again, because you have cannabis in these forms of a derived product and also a flower, we wanted more to measure that concentration. That's where we're using the unit. Units are tracked by a statewide web-based software from seed to sale, and it's called BioTrack. And I'm going to go ahead here a little bit too. So what does 15 ounces look like? So I mentioned earlier, 425 units or 15 ounces is what the patient would have access to. So a half an ounce of dried flower will cover a $1 bill. So if you took $30 bills, laid them out, and covered that with flower product, that's how much patients could have access to over a 90-day period of time. To the left there, or rather to your right, is a 1 unit, what we would call a fatty. Okay, so it's a rolled joint, a large one, and that equals essentially 1 unit. So 425 of those. So a patient could go into a dispensary on day 1, purchase 425, and that would be what they would need to use over the next 90 days. Quite a bit. I think it's a very generous amount. And frankly, I'm not sure we've had anybody hit 425 yet. That change went into effect this past February. Prior to that, it had been 230 units. But again, 425, we wanted to make sure patients had access to an adequate supply. So I'm going to come back to these slides because I want to talk about where do you get the cannabis. So of course, you can go to dispensaries, and there are over 200, and these are increasing daily. RLD and the Cannabis Control Division are licensing new dispensaries all the time. The average price is $10 a gram, but we did see a spike. I heard one report of one dispensary charging $30, and this was, of course, like on April 1st. So I'm not sure if their plan was to disenfranchise patients and try to get just the rec users only, but I think that they have since lowered that price. Other ways you can obtain cannabis are from gifting. So, and it follows the age limit. So I'll talk about that in a second. But you cannot exchange it for money, goods, or services. And patients can gift more than, for example, a recreational user because they have access to more. Or you could grow it. And again, beginning June of last year, under the Cannabis Regulation Act, anybody over the age of 21 could have 6 mature plants and 6 seedlings, not more than 12 mature plants per household. So essentially, they figured, 2 adults in a household, and that was going to be the max that a household could have. And that's new because patients used to be the only ones that could grow. And we used to have a number of patients from the age of 18 to 21 that now no longer have that option to grow. So here's what some cannabis plants look like. And so here's just a summary slide of what enrollment gets a patient when they enroll in the medical cannabis program. We do not collect any fees, and that's often a common misnomer because a lot of times patients, they see a fee associated with registering or getting an application done, but that is a fee charged to them by the provider or agency that is doing the evaluation. The medical cannabis program does not charge for the cards. Processing times can take up to 30 days. That's what we have in statute. But we have been much, much quicker than that because we do have now the electronic portal, which really is saving a lot of time. Also, all the mailing that's involved definitely is helping with that. So we also do need to verify that the patient has a New Mexico driver's license because that is the form of identification that they need to show the dispensary to verify that it is indeed them that is purchasing or obtaining the product. The cards do not expire for 3 years. And so the legislature, they didn't want us printing cards repeatedly year after year after year. And you can imagine with 133,000 people and all the postage, that would be quite a bit of a waste of resources. And so the card now is good for 3 years. And the requirement is for the patient to see their medical provider at least once a year to do an annual verification to keep the card in good standing. Now, I recommend providers see patient more frequently than that because we really want to know if it's working or not. If you can have a patient change the form of cannabis that they're utilizing, they may see benefits that they didn't see before. Or if they're having a negative impact, we want to guide them and direct them to a different form that they might find more useful. And again, providers are protected by state law. Remember, you're certifying the presence of a condition. You're not prescribing cannabis. And this is sort of a two-edged sword. It protects providers, but at the same time, because we don't write a prescription or get out the old prescription pad and write down a dose, there's large amounts of confusion with regards to, well, what should I take? What should I do? What dose do I do? And it's been sort of, providers haven't quite taken that role. And I sort of want to encourage that anytime a patient is evaluated, make sure you're giving them guidance as far as what type of product you think they're going to benefit from and what a good starting dose would be. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And we do need original signatures on all applications. This is patients might go into a clinic and the provider sign and then they send it in. They haven't signed, we have to send it back to them. We do need original signatures. But again, with the electronic portal, we did find a way to enable both the patient and provider to sign the application. So I'm going to go back to these slides here because I want to address sort of the gorilla in the room. It's what is different between medical and recreational, and what are we going to see? So let's talk about what medical and rec have in common. Number one, you can't use it in public, okay? So again, parked at the park, again, that's in the public setting. You can't be using medicinal or recreational cannabis. People can give product, but they can't sell or exchange goods. We talked about that earlier. Anybody 21 or older can grow. We talked about the maximum. Products must be stored safely in a secure way. And this is something that definitely applies to both recreational and medical. Shortly after recreational went into effect, there was an instance down in Algodones where a youngster took in gummies to school. And they had 14 kids have to be evaluated in emergency rooms. So again, we want to stress product safety, store the product away. So much of the product is brightly colored. The gummies, it looks like candy, cookies, brownies. I mean, what kid wouldn't be enticed? So definitely secure in a well, we recommend a locked box, but safely stored. Keep away from children and pets. And then cannabis cannot be transported across state lines. So again, Texans coming across the border, they need to consume it here. Going back over the state lines, that would be an infringement on federal law. So again, the Texans seem to want to be purchasing a lot of New Mexico cannabis, but that would be illegal to transport across state lines. So, and if you do purchase cannabis, it has to be from an intrastate source. People aren't shipping cannabis in from California to sell here. The cannabis that's here in our dispensaries is grown in New Mexico. So buy local, buy New Mexican. So differences. So as I mentioned earlier, medical patients can have, well, they have access to 425 units or 15 ounces over a 90-day period of time. And if they, and that would be not taxed, okay? And that seems to be one of the big benefits of having the medical cannabis card is that, you know, that's a 20% savings. They can purchase more than that. So again, rec users and medical patients can purchase unlimited cannabis if they choose to. It's just that the medical patients would only get the tax benefit on that first 425 or units or 15 ounces. 18 or older can consume cannabis in the medical cannabis program. If you're younger than 18, then you would have to have a caregiver or guardian. And you must be 21 or older to use it recreationally. So a concern of mine, and I'll raise this, is I'm keeping an eye on how many 18 to 21-year-olds start applying to our program. And luckily, we haven't seen a huge increase in that yet. But again, that's a concern because that age group now, they can't consume recreationally. And again, you don't need any type of certification to go purchase recreationally. To utilize the medical cannabis card, as I mentioned earlier, you do need to do an annual verification to keep the card in good standing. And again, the medical program, the Department of Health, we maintain the patient registry. The Cannabis Control Division, they're the ones that more are overseeing the dispensaries and would take the complaints when a patient has an issue with the dispensary. DOH does not have oversight over the dispensaries or even the growing facilities, the producers. So this summary handout really puts all of the differences and similarities between the two. This is on our website. I got this yesterday. We finally got it back. And this is what most of the questions are coming from. So I do encourage you to visit our website, have this available if you have patients that have questions. It's a quick summary and a sort of a cheat sheet, Cliff's notes to the difference between the medical and recreational cannabis in our state. All right, we talked about that. Okay, so here's examples of the medical cards. They're no longer chipped, but as you can see, they have these recertification dates or the annual verification dates on the left side and then the expiration date down on the bottom. And so if a patient does reach that expiration date, that card will no longer function. They would have to get a new evaluation and get a reprint done at that time. But again, hopefully they're doing their annual verifications as well. And continuing to see the provider and get feedback. But that's what they look like. So if you want to be a provider that certifies patients for the medical cannabis program, there are some requirements that you do need to reach or have. Number one, you do need to have a New Mexico license from your respective licensing board, Board of Nursing, Medical Board, PA. And you have to have a New Mexico controlled substance number. Again, you wouldn't have the New Mexico controlled substance number if you didn't have a DEA license. And so we utilize the New Mexico controlled substance number really as our linchpin, our research. That's what I look at first to make sure that a provider can certify a patient. I like this next requirement is that the primary place of practice must be in the state of New Mexico. Again, with telemedicine, we have a lot of providers in Maine, New York, New Jersey, trying to poach, I call our New Mexico patients. And I think that New Mexico is unique, and we have a unique rule setting. We have a unique population, and I think that keeping it as with New Mexico providers has been helpful for the patients. And of course, don't write for a medical cannabis card for your spouse or your kids, things that you wouldn't do typically anyway with medications. And if there's any we haven't necessarily prohibited anybody. Everybody pretty much follows those regulations, except for individuals from out of state that we have had to, deny access to the portal. So why should you certify? I talked about this a little bit earlier. If you don't, somebody else will. And with the advent of the recreational cannabis, we need to ask every patient, do they use cannabis? It needs to follow up after we ask them if they consume alcohol or if they smoke tobacco. We then should ask them if they utilize cannabis. It's going to become a question that we need to really start considering with every patient and actually incorporating into our interviews, probably into the questionnaires in the waiting room as well. Documented participation in the state medical program can oftentimes be helpful for patients if they have a job that might not necessarily allow them to consume recreationally, but if they have their medical cannabis cards, sometimes employers are okay with that and the patient can continue to utilize it for their benefit. The tax benefits we talked about earlier. And again, if a patient has a medical cannabis card, if they leave the state, they can typically, there'll be a reciprocity program so the patient can access cannabis in that other state. And other states have different, like for their rec programs, different purchasing requirements, or if it's a state that doesn't even have rec but does have medical, if the patient goes there for a trip or something, they would hopefully be able to access that state's program by having their card here and the reciprocity. All right. So here's an example of our paper application. We still take paper applications. We know that a lot of people don't have access to electronics or cell phones, and it's very difficult to submit things in that format. So we will always accept the paper application. And I think this is really conducive to that in-person experience. Like if you have a patient that's in your office, gosh, get their signature then, you sign it then, send it in, and it's done. If the patient is telemedicine, then of course, we want you to use the portal. And this is an example of the landing page. Patients can create an account and then log into that account, and they can even track their purchases. But again, this is the web site, the address to get to our online portal. It's MCP for Medical Cannabis Program -patient-tracking.nmhealth.org. I do invite you to go, and I'll go back here. Wait, let me go. There are some vignettes, the little boxes in the middle there, the tabs. If you click on those, we do have instruction on how to do the application. It's essentially the paper application, just in electronic form. And what we do need with the application would be clinical notes. So your clinical notes, if you do an electronic note, there's an upload button, you click the upload, and then you drag your notes right into the electronic application. When the provider finishes their half of the application, they hit submit, and then the application goes to the patient. And then the patient uploads their driver's license, and that's how we have the form of the driver's license to verify the patient. And then they also have the opportunity to sign. So that's how we get the original signatures in the electronic format. And again, there's still, it's a little clunky right now. I've been helping a lot of providers. We converse quite often, and I'm always there to help, but it's been getting smoother and smoother the more that a provider has the chance to utilize the online portal. So, but again, if you've had patients that have moved across the state, the telemedicine or the electronic application, it definitely would be something you could utilize. Okay, so is cannabis safe? And you know, pretty much it is. Cannabis has an extraordinarily high estimated lethal dose, equivalent to smoking approximately 1,500 pounds of cannabis in 15 minutes. So yeah. And again, I think one reason why cannabis is safe or perceived as safe is because the low density of CB1 receptors in the brainstem. So there's no real respiratory or cardiac functions that are going to be hampered or impaired with a lot of cannabis use, okay? So unlike the opioids or benzos, we're not going to have patients decrease their respirations and have a fatal event. Interestingly, potencies are increasing. So just with the flower, it's gone from 4 to up to 31%. And then some of the dabs or the concentrates, there was one that was advertising recently claiming to have 99.9% THC. And I have some pictures of what these products look like because, you know, some people might, what's a dab, you know? So let me get to those. So how is cannabis consumed? And this is where, you know, we sort of need to understand this to help our patients benefit the most. It can be vaporized, smoked, ingested. There's topical, sublingual, rectal, and vaginal. So as you can imagine, it's if you can add it, then you'll find THC in the product. So Again, as I was mentioning earlier, dosing is sort of the biggest and most difficult thing because we're not prescribing it and the science isn't done with regards to how much really would work for a patient. And patients are everyone's metabolism is unique. It also depends if you have a full belly or not, if you consume an edible, whether and how quickly you will absorb it. So, and then the variable potencies, the complex pharmacology, our metabolisms, prior experience. If somebody's been utilizing cannabis for a very long amount of time, they could be desensitized. They might have a higher tolerance for higher doses than people that have not used it previously. So this is an example here. These are the dabs and waxes up on the top. And what will happen is that it's typically highly concentrated. It will be put into a dab rig. I have a slide coming up next. And then a heat source will be utilized to essentially melt and vaporize that. And then the THC will be consumed. The benefit of vaporized, and again, that's an old vape pit down there. You might remember there were some issues with vape cartridges a couple of years back. And that was because of the chemicals that were being added to it. But it's gotten better to the sense that the dispensaries, when they do get inspected, the products are safer there. I think the safest is there is a vaporizer where you can take the flower, put it in, it essentially dehydrates it, and then it's a water vapor that's consumed. So you're not getting any of the combustion products. And so if you had a patient that needed that quick onset of a vaporized product, that would be a way that they could consume it pretty safely. But this is what those dab rigs look like. So as you can see, the marketing is a little bit questionable. But again, the nail up there is where the wax and you can see it there, is put, and then they use either a blowtorch. Now they do have electronic heaters now that will melt that to the temperature needed to extract the THC vapor. But again, when you watch the videos online, it's quite sooty and a lot of combustion product there. So again, I question the safety of that one. As you can see up top there, that is a pre-roll. That's about a third. Remember, I had the fatty earlier that was 1 unit. That's about a third of a unit is the pre-roll. So you can imagine a patient could carry around about 1,200 of those in a 90-day period of time. That's how much access they have to cannabis, medical cannabis. So smoking, again, you can have some bronchial irritation. And the patients that use the smokable, again, they like the quick onset. They can titrate the dose rather easily. They can, just not puff if they don't need to feel the impairment or the cannabis effect. So still widely used. Ingested, gummies, brownies, you name it. Cannabis is finding its way into it. Beverages as well. Wines where they take out the alcohol component, but then we'll add the THC component. One thing about the gummies is that this is, for those elderly patients that really haven't had experience smoking it or are reticent to smoke it, or think about somebody with asthma or some bronchial issues, typically, the edibles will be what is used. Now, the edibles typically would be consumed at nighttime because the onset was going to be very variable and typically will be like an hour and a half to 2 hours. And the potency or the effect can actually be increased over the inhalation. So I would not recommend taking edibles in the morning if somebody has, work or driving, picking up kids from school, that type of thing to do. So these are typically used best at night. There are tinctures sublingual. They're beneficial in the sense that they have a more rapid onset, not as rapid as the inhaled or vaporized form, but they do, and you can just a couple drops under the tongue. The patient can really measure that and titrate an exact dose for themselves. And again, it's a rather easy form. You can have the drops or tinctures in your purse or in your backpack, what have you, and then utilize it. It's a little less conspicuous than inhaling or vaporizing. Topicals. So again, there aren't that many CB1 receptors in the skin. So, you might see topicals actually report having a really high THC component. But again, if you can package it, they'll buy it. And of course, it's making its way into a vaginal form. And again, also rectal suppositories for those that can't really consume it in other ways or fashions. And prostate cancer is the main one for the rectal suppository. And we do have some patients that is solely what they use. So what are some baseline things that we can, rules that we can follow when we are trying to help a patient determine how to dose themselves? And one thing we want to do is, of course, individualize the regimen. What works for one patient might not work for another. We are starting questionnaires, asking patients, what do you take for your specific condition, okay? So we're trying to equate, what products are going to work best for what conditions, but a lot of times the patients already have, an anecdotal history with what works best for them. You want to allow the patient to self-titrate. Again, I actually recommend patients don't necessarily feel the effects of the medical cannabis the first time they use it, because we don't want them to consume too much and have a paranoia episode and then have an adverse effect. So again, if they don't feel it the first couple times, they can incrementally increase that. And one thing is with the edibles, be aware that a cookie might be 4 servings and not just 1. So we always want to have that conversation with patients as well. If one route doesn't work, try another one. Okay, so if the edibles don't work, they take too long to kick in, consider the tinctures that go under the tongue. That might work better for a patient. And you always want to keep in mind the age of the patient as well. Some of the younger patients are more, will engage different forms more readily than other patients. Maintaining a journal might be the most important thing. It's one thing we do send out with every card. We do have a pamphlet, and we do encourage patients to keep that journal. Keep the dose, what worked, how much, what time of day, what did you eat before? Did you take this right after a heavy meal, or was it on an empty stomach? All those things are going to have impact with regards to how the cannabis works. And then THC and CBD. So CBD, that is what comes out of the hemp. CBD is not, it's ubiquitous. It has more anti-inflammatory component to it. So oftentimes if I had a patient maybe with severe chronic pain, 5 milligrams of CBD with a 5 milligram THC gummy at nighttime would work really well. So we want to talk about what those ratios mean. The CBD does not have the psychoactive component to it that the THC does. And so that's why you see numerous CBD products around everywhere you go, but you don't see THC cannabis products around everywhere you go, and you have to go to the dispensary for that. So the adage, start low and go slow. If they just puff, oh, the joint's going to burn out, and they could easily get themselves quite paranoid. And so again, start low and go slow. Oral, wait 30 to 60 minutes if you're before consuming any more. I'd maybe say the more the 60 as we see increased concentrations. It might not take that second bite before somebody actually feels the effects of the product. So smoked versus oral, I was talking a little bit about this earlier. Smoked has a rapid rise in the blood, rapid effects, and then it falls quickly, and so the effect ceases. They can last for 4 to 6 hours. And then the oral, it's much slower absorption, less predictable, and the effects are delayed. And the effects can actually be more pronounced with an edible after gut clearance than just the inhalation. So you want to be aware that a patient that does take a gummy at night might actually, in the middle of the night, really have the impairment or the psychoactive sensory at that point. So rapid onset of high with smoking, delayed with the oral. And with regards to the research, again, up until 2017, this was a study done, it was retrospective, and essentially all these academies got together, looked at all of the research and tried to compile pretty much a cannabis Bible going forward. Not much has been done since then, but I think that with the new administration, we are seeing cannabis research starting again. And so we'll see more hardcore data with regards to the effects of cannabis, what conditions they help, if they truly help or not, if it truly helps or not. But again, that's definitely a resource to go to if you have a question with regards to the benefits of cannabis for a certain condition. Okay, so side effects of cannabis use. It pretty much can affect any of these systems. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because we're running out of time. Respiratory, cardiac, cognitive, of course, psychiatric. Back to psychiatric again, you saw that PTSD was the #1 qualifying condition for patients. And again, that's because it seems to be quite a bit of a catch-all. Anxiety is not, there's no other, except for opioid use disorder, there's no other psychiatric condition that the cannabis is really used for, or that's a qualifying condition here in New Mexico. This is cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. We've heard about this. Patients go to the ER and they have what they call scromiting. They're screaming and vomiting at the same time. Again, it seems to be more of a headline in the media than really, happening. We might see more of this now that it is recreational here in the state of New Mexico, but that's what that is. Drug interactions. Cannabis, again, it is very, very, very safe, but it can have interactions. Again, the major drug interactions here are mostly with sedatives or opioids, where it causes an increased sedative effect. But again, it by itself is not going to be the fatal component. It's going to be whatever it's consumed with. And then the only food interaction was really with alcohol. And again, it's that increased sedation. Now, there are some blood pressure medications that it does have interactions with, and it's on the slides there if you want to refer to it. Again, these are all here. Red flag interactions would be, again, the CNS suppressants, but warfarin is one. So you might see increased bleeding time if with the use of the cannabis. You want to be aware of that. And then it does reduce the efficacy of theophylline. So I shouldn't say who should not use cannabis. I should probably say caution when using cannabis in these patients. Again, pregnant women, psychiatric disorders, the schizophrenia, and that's going to be more in a younger male population. And again, that seems to be more of an issue with the concentrates and frequent use of high concentration cannabis. Colorado recently was going to address high potency cannabis products. And they passed a law recently. They didn't outlaw high potency, but they did put some safeguards in. So lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, and of course, if someone has adverse drug reaction, you want to be sure that cannabis isn't interfering with it. And I think that this is an area that we're going to learn more and more about, the drug interactions between cannabis and medications as more people utilize it. Cannabis use disorder does exist. This is something I think that school nurses, individuals, maybe the correctional population that are on parole want to be aware of, because we want to be able to identify this early. But again, it's not as dangerous per se as for an alcohol use disorder. A patient can have cannabis withdrawal, but it's not going to be a fatal event. And talking about cannabis withdrawal, again, not life-threatening compared to alcohol or benzos. Again, irritability, sleep disturbances, decreased appetite, pretty much what we would expect to see. Okay, so cannabis impairment. Again, the reason I address this is because this is a big concern with regards to all the new recreational users, is what type of effect will it have on people driving and in social settings. And so despite the risk, many people still drive after consuming cannabis. And so this is, alcohol versus THC and how we measure that. THC is a fat soluble molecule, and therefore we don't have that linear representation. You can't measure somebody's blood and tell how impaired they are when they've been using cannabis, because the uptake is so quick and into the fat, i.e. the brain. So if we can figure out how to measure impairment that's $1 billion project. You know, you will have solved quite the issue there. But that's why it's such a difficult product, a difficult chemical to follow with regards to impairment and with regards to the traffic and all of the issues with that. So alcohol testing may represent how impaired a person is. THC testing does not necessarily reflect that. High blood levels might indicate recent use, but if you have a chronic user, they might also have high levels as well. And so if you have a medical patient that's been on a high use or high dose, they could have high blood levels and may not be impaired at all. So this is actually a question we get quite a bit, cannabis and guns, you know. The state of New Mexico has no laws or regulations around weapon possession in the medical cannabis program. However, the federal government does, okay? And I direct you to that website there. The federal government does require on their questionnaire that you address whether you use any mind altering or impairing substances. And so we never want patients to lie. If they're utilizing cannabis and they want to have a gun, they should report on that questionnaire that they use it. They might get rejected from purchasing that gun and then they'll have to make a decision. But if there was an infraction and the federal government did call our program, we would have to answer whether the person is in the program or not, but it is nothing that we typically divulge, okay? But that would be an example where, you know, if the patient was, the card would not protect the patient from any type of federal gun charges. So cannabis is just one therapy. And I bring this up because sometimes I talk to my colleagues that said, you know, there's other substances and chemicals that are being evaluated and actually are probably, again, FDA designed as breakthrough therapy. They're farther along the pathway than cannabis with regards to some of the studies because cannabis is such a difficult substance to study. You have over 105 different cannabinoids. You have all the terpenes and all of those mixed together. The variables, there's just so much variability to cannabis. But again, ketamine, LSD, MDMA, and magic mushrooms or the psilocybin, these are things that we might see follow the same pathway to cannabis with regards to use and legalization. You know, sometimes I wonder if we'll have cards to issue for this and then maybe see it become more mainstream, but we'll see. So again, with regards to, these are the handouts we have. Our website is up there at the top and these educational materials are there. I do think that having some of these, especially if you have a younger patient population that might be considering utilizing cannabis, you know, have these available to them. It does talk about the program, safety, of course, and then also where to access information. This is, again, the safe storage handout. We came up with this and we launched it just before April 1st. And we launched it in coordination with the Health Alert Network, AHAN. And 2 days later is when that ingestion occurred down in Algodones with the 14 kids. So it was fortuitous when we did put that out. And that's, again, on the website there. Poison control, you know, if you have a patient come into the emergency room and there's some cannabis use involved there, this is definitely a handout that could be given to the patient, the parent, going forward. And then pregnancy and home, we did partner with CARA to create this handout to, you know, address cannabis and pregnancy because a lot of young women, despite being pregnant, view cannabis as not as a health benefit. It's marketed in such a way that they see it almost as it's not deleterious at all, but it actually is enhancing. And so we want to, of course, get the appropriate message out there that secondhand cannabis smoke can be problematic for youngsters. And of course, keeping the product safe and out of reach. So, any questions?
This may be a dumb question, but it's legal under state law, but illegal under federal law. What does it mean that it's illegal under federal law? Are they likely to have the FBI come break down their door sort of thing? I just don't understand exactly how that works.
Yeah, essentially the federal government has sort of a hands-off approach. Now, again, that seems to be the norm at this point, but there always is that threat there, or that perception or perceived threat. And so it's legal in the state, and as long as the feds don't pursue it, then we will continue with it. But yeah, it's sad that there isn't more of a uniform policy between the two, because I think that just with crossing from state line, one state to another, we'd see more consistency. Patients would, everyone would have just more of an understanding of cannabis and its use. But yeah, the feds just pretty much stay out of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I have two questions. I certify patients. I'm in end-stage dialysis, and I have a patient that I'm convinced has hyperemesis syndrome based on cannabis. He, however, is not. He has documented gastroparesis in stage for 5 years, chronic smoker all day, all night kind of thing. What's the treatment?
I think in that instance, you're going to have to invite the patient just not to use, because the gastroparesis, that is why I think the cannabis is probably an issue there, because it does hit those receptors in the gut and cause delayed emptying, and that's the mechanism for the hyperemesis. So that paired with the condition could definitely be it. High concentrates also seem to be something that predisposes patients to the hyperemesis, but probably just ask for a med holiday, and see if the hyperemesis
He's on a hard
goes
no.
away. Yeah. That's the one recommendation. I wouldn't recommend necessarily a gut stimulant to go along with it. They just probably need to peel it back and understand it for themselves, that could definitely be a predisposing factor to it. So yeah, that's what my recommendations are. It's to help alleviate the symptoms, and here it sounds like it's causing them and making them worse in this patient.
Okay, so my second question is more of probably a general question that a burning question that a lot of people are asking is, once we certify a patient, they go into the dispensary, who the heck is giving them dosing recommendations? Because it's not coming from providers.
Correct, and that's sad, because I think that providers really should take that opportunity to give some instruction to patients. And again, part of that is because look at the products. There's so many, there's new ones every day. How do we keep up with that? We don't have a pharmacopoeia that tells us how to prescribe or recommend cannabis. It's going to be quote unquote the bud tenders. That's sort of how they are termed. And so again, they typically are individuals that have utilized cannabis, so they do have insight with regards to some of the effects. Some are wonderful. They know definitely how to guide a patient to what the patient might want, and they would know because they've used the product most likely themselves. Sadly, there are some that direct patients to products that might be high potency or high price. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely not what we want patients to be pushed towards, because that can be problematic. So that's who's likely doing it. The other would be family members, would be also a source that patients use to help guide them toward what type of product to use.
And for me, I have a lot of patients that share that information and will tell me, hey, one ear of the gummy, that's all you need. Don't just eat one, don't eat 2 ears.
And again, patients find that product, and they will use that product repeatedly. And it's sort of a source of comfort, especially with the elderly patients. They choose something, and even if it doesn't work, they'll stick with it. And that's why I do think that the follow-ups is very, very important, because if they're not having a really good response, we want to offer them or encourage them to try something else. Or they ate the whole the whole cookie all at once and had a horrific experience. And you really do have to peel that away, because that does happen, and that makes people fearful. So I think we need to push this back into the realm of the provider. We have to be more comfortable actually having that patient have an idea of what they could use. And again, speaking to your patients and finding out that anecdotal history with what has worked for others is going to be guidance with regards to what you can recommend to your patient. You shouldn't be fearful of it. And again, I think it goes back to that, prescribing versus certifying a condition. And are we prescribing something and breaking federal law because it still is considered a Schedule I substance? you know, and again, it's the grand experiment, really. You know, we're in a sort of a gray territory here where, you know, it's legal in the state, but there are individuals, providers that are fearful that the feds will come knocking on their door, and that's warranted. I mean, it's very, very unlikely, but again, there is that concern there. Oh, right there.
I work at a federally qualified health center, so I can no longer help patients get medical cannabis permits, but I did it when I was in private practice. I had a friend who had stage 4 colon cancer, and we went to a dispensary in Albuquerque several years ago called Verde, and there was a RN there who was very well versed in really helping her decide what to do, what to choose for certain symptoms. They also produce their own cannabis. So I think that there are some medical dispensaries that have people that know what they're doing, but Verde was a really good choice for my friend when she had cancer, and it's here in
Yeah,
Albuquerque.
That's great to hear. And again, yeah. Correct. If you have a patient that you find is not utilizing the cannabis appropriately, or utilizing it or selling it even, or, you know, didn't really, they don't have the condition they initially represented that they qualified for, we can't cancel that. But you as a provider, if you sent us a letter stating I'm rescinding my, you know, qualification of this patient, my certification of this patient, then we could rescind the card. But it would be up to the provider to do that. We as a program don't really have the ability to cancel people's cards because, again, we didn't evaluate the patient, the provider did, but we would accept that information for the provider. And I wanted to piggyback onto what you were sharing about the caregiver. You know, so for example, I mentioned the minors, the under 18s that would require a guardian. We also do have the caregiver, like a spouse or daughter for, imagine a patient on hospice or post-op that they can't go and get the cannabis for themselves. A caregiver could sign up with the patient and go purchase for them. And so the caregiver would then have the caregiver application, they would have their driver's license, they would have their own card, and then they would purchase on behalf for the patient. And so that is an option as well the program has, and it works really well for cancer patients.
Okay, I have a question that everybody wants to know the answer to. Where do you find a plant to grow your own at home?
Some dispensaries sell seeds. I would look on Facebook forums to some of the cannabis. I think the dispensaries were selling seeds, though, is my last. And again, this is where the intrastate source becomes a rather particular thing. Gifting, that would be another area for you to obtain them. I honestly haven't seen the clones other than when I've visited a dispensary. But yeah,
I think that's our time's up. So
Yeah.
yeah, we really appreciate you,
right.
Dr. French. Okay, well, that leaves us for lunch. So everybody's already gone. They're all headed out for lunch. So we'll be back for your breakout session at 1:30. You'll get to choose which room you want to be in. So come back, look at your schedule, see which ballroom you're in, and we'll be back at 1:30.